The sun, or what passed for it in the umbral realm, had long since dipped below the jagged horizon, plunging the barren landscape into a deeper, oppressive darkness. The air grew colder, biting against Rose's skin as she and Kalian found shelter in the crumbled remains of an ancient stone structure. It wasn't much, just a few walls and the hint of a roof, worn smooth by centuries of forgotten storms, but it would serve as a refuge for the night. Rose crouched by the remains of a long-dead fire pit, her fingers brushing over the blackened stones. Ancient soot came away on her fingertips, telling tales of travellers long past. With a flick of her wrist, she conjured a small flame, coaxing it into life as the pit flared with warmth. The soft glow illuminated the space, casting flickering shadows across the worn stone and revealing faded runes etched into the walls. Kalian leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed as he watched her, the firelight dancing across his features. "You really are something else, you know that?" Rose glanced up at him, her expression unreadable, though something flickered in her eyes. "If you're going to start telling me how impressive I am, at least make yourself useful and gather some firewood." Kalian smirked, pushing off the wall with fluid grace. "Firewood," she says, "in the middle of a wasteland. You really know how to set a man up for success." She rolled her eyes, but the faintest smile played on her lips. "Fine. Then at least stop standing there and sit. You're making the place colder just by loitering." He chuckled and joined her by the fire, settling on the ground a few feet away. For a while neither of them spoke, the crackle of the flames filling the silence. Rose stared into the fire, her mind replaying the ambush from earlier. The shadows of the day's battle seemed to dance in the flames. "They were waiting for us," she said finally, her voice low, barely audible above the fire's whisper. Kalian tilted his head, his expression thoughtful, all traces of his usual playfulness gone. Maybe. Or maybe they're just drawn to the crystal's energy, same as we are. Either way, you handled it like a pro. Rose didn't respond immediately, her fingers absently tracing the leather coil of her whip, feeling the residual warmth from the day's battle. "I shouldn't have let them get so close. I got too caught up in the fight." "Are you kidding?" Kalian said, his tone incredulous. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the intensity in his eyes. "You practically danced through those things. I've never seen anything like it. If I hadn't been there, I'd have sworn you didn't need any backup." She glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "You're not just saying that?" His grin softened, replaced by something more sincere that transformed his entire face. "Rose, I've seen a lot of things in my time. But you're the real deal." The warmth in his voice caught her off guard, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the fire. Her cheeks felt uncomfortably warm, though she wasn't sure if it was from the flames or his words. The silence that followed felt different somehow, charged with something she wasn't ready to name. The cold crept in as the night deepened, the fire only managing to push it back so far. Rose adjusted her cloak, pulling it tighter around her shoulders. Despite the fire, a shiver ran through her, and Kalian noticed immediately. "You're freezing," he said, moving closer. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her body betrayed her with another shiver. Kalian didn't hesitate. He shrugged off his own cloak and draped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment as he adjusted it around her. "There. Better." Rose hesitated, her instinct to brush him off warring with the undeniable comfort of the extra warmth. Finally, she nodded. "Yeah, thanks." She pulled Kalian's cloak tighter around her shoulders, her fingers brushing over its rough fabric. The warmth it provided felt like a fragile barrier against the chill of the world, and the chill within her. His scent lingered on the fabric, a mix of smoke and something she couldn't quite place. "You really think I'm not like them?" she asked after a long silence, the question escaping before she could stop it. Kalian leaned back slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation or concern, she couldn't tell. "No," he said firmly, "you're nothing like them." They see you as a tool. I see you as... He hesitated, the faintest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. As someone who deserves so much more than this place. Rose's throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, trying to push down the surge of emotion his words brought. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice quieter now. "This place, the Order, it's all I've ever known." Kalian reached out, his hand brushing against hers where it rested on her knee. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a warmth through her that rivaled the fire. "That doesn't mean it's all you're meant for," he said softly. She turned to him then, her eyes searching his face for something, an answer, a reassurance, maybe even a lie she could believe in. What she found instead was a sincerity that felt too perfect to trust completely. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice tinged with both suspicion and hope. Kalian's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes remained somber. "Because I've been where you are, feeling trapped, wondering if there's anything beyond the walls they've built around you. And because..." He paused, his gaze dropping for the briefest moment before returning to hers. "Because I care about you, Rose, more than I probably should." The admission hit her like a jolt, and she felt her breath catch. Kalian, who had appeared in her life so suddenly, cared about her. It seemed too convenient, too perfect, and yet she wanted to believe it. Rose leaned into him slightly, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "Kalian..." He reached up, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face before lingering at her cheek. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. I needed you to know." For a moment, the space between them dissolved, and Rose allowed herself to feel the vulnerability she had kept locked away for so long. She leaned into his touch, her walls crumbling even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered warnings she chose to ignore. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rose allowed herself to feel safe. Despite the dangerous mission ahead and the uncertainty that plagued her, there was something about his presence that made her feel anchored. And though she couldn't name the emotions swirling within her, couldn't trust them completely, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. The thought was both comforting and terrifying, especially given how quickly he had managed to slip past her defenses. The first thing Rose noticed was the warmth. For a moment she forgot where she was, lulled by the steady rise and fall of the chest beneath her cheek. Her eyes blinked open, the dim light of the umbral morning filtering through the cracks in the ruined walls around them, casting strange patterns across the ancient stone. Then she realized. Kalian's arm was draped around her shoulders, her head resting against him. His cloak was still wrapped tightly around her, and her legs were tucked against his, as if she had instinctively sought his warmth in the chill of the night. The intimacy of their position sent a jolt through her body. Heat rushed to her face, and it had nothing to do with her fire magic. She sat up quickly, pulling the cloak tighter around herself as she avoided his gaze. The sudden movement made her dizzy, her muscles stiff from sleeping against stone. Kalian stirred at her movement, his eyes flickering open. For a brief moment he looked startled, vulnerable even, his expression softening as he took in her flushed face. "Morning," he said, his voice husky with sleep. Rose shifted uncomfortably, suddenly hyper-aware of how close they had been, of how easily she had let her guard down. "Morning," she mumbled, focusing on the dying embers of the fire instead of him. Kalian stretched, his movements slow and deliberate, as if trying not to break the fragile quiet between them. "I wasn't expecting to wake up with company," he teased lightly, though his tone was more playful than mocking. There was something careful in the way he watched her, as if gauging her reaction. Rose shot him a glare, her embarrassment flaring. "Don't read into it. It was freezing and your cloak wasn't enough." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, a defensive edge to mask her confusion. Kalian chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair enough. But if you're trying to hurt my feelings, you'll have to try harder than that. His easy manner only made her more flustered. She rolled her eyes, though a small, involuntary smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Let's just focus on getting moving. We're wasting time. She began gathering her things, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. He raised his hands in mock surrender. As you wish, Firebrand. The nickname carried a new warmth now, one that made her stomach flutter despite her best efforts to ignore it. As they broke camp, the awkwardness lingered, neither of them addressing the intimacy of the night before directly. Rose worked with an unusual focus, packing her supplies with quick, precise movements that betrayed her inner turmoil. Kalian, for his part, watched her with quiet amusement, clearly enjoying her discomfort but choosing not to press it further. The morning air was heavy with unspoken words. You know, he said as they prepared to leave, adjusting his own pack with deliberate casualness. You're cute when you're flustered. Rose froze mid-motion, her eyes narrowing as she turned to him. Heat crept up her neck despite her best efforts to remain composed. Kalian. He held up his hands again, his grin unrepentant. Okay. No more teasing. For now. There was something in his eyes, though, a knowing look that made her stomach tighten. Shaking her head, Rose slung her pack over her shoulder and started walking, grateful for the excuse to hide her face. Come on. The crystal isn't going to find itself. Kalian fell into step beside her, his smile softening as he glanced her way. You know, you can try all you want to act tough, but I think last night proved you're not as cold as you pretend to be. Rose didn't respond, her pace quickening slightly. But she couldn't stop the warmth that bloomed in her chest at his words, or the uneasy flutter of something deeper. His presence beside her felt different now, charged with possibilities she wasn't ready to acknowledge. And beneath it all, a whisper of doubt she couldn't quite silence. Was she letting him get too close, too quickly? The air grew heavier as they approached the heart of the desolate landscape. The path twisted downward into a canyon-like crevice, the jagged walls glowing faintly with an eerie crimson light that seemed to pulse in time with Rose's heartbeat. She could feel it, the pull of the flame-heart crystal resonating deep within her chest, like a second heartbeat growing stronger with each step. We're close, she said, her voice quieter than usual as the oppressive energy of the place pressed down on her. The power in the air felt ancient, hungry. Kalian nodded, his usual teasing replaced by a focused intensity she hadn't seen before. It feels alive, like it's waiting for something, or someone. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade, eyes scanning the shadows that danced along the walls. Rose glanced at him but didn't respond. She didn't trust the words forming in her own mind, let alone anyone else's. The crystal's pull was becoming overwhelming, drowning out everything else. Instead, she pressed on, her whip uncoiled in her hand, its leather glinting faintly in the unnatural light. The narrow path opened into a cavern, the ceiling arching high above them like the ribs of some massive, long-dead beast. Strange runes carved into the walls seemed to writhe in the flickering light. At its center atop a jagged pedestal of black stone floated the flame-heart crystal. It pulsed with a deep, fiery glow, the light flickering like an ember struggling to stay alight, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them. Rose stopped in her tracks, the sight stealing her breath. The crystal was beautiful and terrible all at once, its power washing over her in waves that made her both exhilarated and uneasy. Every fibre of her being screamed both to reach for it and to run. That's it, Kalian said, his voice hushed as he stepped closer. You can feel it, can't you? It's calling to you. There was an edge to his voice she couldn't quite read. Rose nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the handle of her whip. The crystal's power sang through her veins, a siren call she couldn't ignore. Stay back, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. I don't know what's going to happen when I touch it. Kalian hesitated, then took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of compliance. Something flickered across his face. Concern? Anticipation? Before settling into reassurance. You've got this, firebrand. Show it who's boss. Rose approached the pedestal, each step heavier than the last. The crystal's light grew brighter as she neared, its pulsing rhythm syncing with her own heartbeat until she could no longer tell them apart. When she was close enough to touch it, the air around her seemed to ignite, the temperature rising so sharply that sweat beaded on her skin. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as her fingers brushed the surface of the crystal. The moment they made contact, a surge of fire erupted around her, engulfing her in a swirling vortex of flame that turned the cavern into a furnace. The fire was unlike anything she'd ever felt. Wild, ancient, and alive with purpose. Rose, Kalian's voice was distant, muffled by the roaring fire. She caught a glimpse of his face through the flames, twisted with concern. Or was it anticipation? She couldn't focus on him. All she could feel was the overwhelming heat and the pull of the crystal's power. It wasn't just testing her, it was challenging her, pushing her to prove she was worthy of its ancient might. Every instinct screamed at her to let go, to retreat from this primal force. Control. The word echoed in her mind, a voice that wasn't her own but felt familiar nonetheless, like a memory she'd forgotten she had. You are the fire, not the flame. Rose gritted her teeth, summoning every ounce of focus she had. The fire raged against her, trying to consume her, but she stood firm. She thought of all the times the Order had called her weak, uncontrolled. Not anymore. Slowly the flames began to bend to her will, swirling around her in a controlled spiral, responding to her command rather than her fear. When the fire finally subsided, Rose stood with the crystal in her hand, its light now steady and calm, pulsing in perfect harmony with her heartbeat. She felt its power coursing through her, not just amplifying her magic, but completing it somehow, as if it had been waiting for her all along. For the first time in her life, she felt truly in control, truly herself. The raw power that had always threatened to overwhelm her now flowed through her like a perfectly conducted symphony. Kalian rushed to her side as the flames faded, his expression a mix of relief and awe. His hand hovered near her arm, as if unsure whether to touch her in this transformed state. "You did it," he said, his voice breathless. "That was incredible." The look in his eyes held something deeper than simple admiration. Rose looked at him, her eyes still glowing faintly with the crystal's light, power thrumming through her veins like liquid fire. "It's done," she said simply, though the weight of what had just happened resonated in her voice. The crystal pulsed warmly in her hand, as if agreeing. Kalian's gaze softened, and he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. The touch felt different now, charged with the energy still radiating from her skin. "You were amazing, Rose. I don't think anyone else could have done that." There was a note of pride in his voice that made her heart flutter traitorously. She allowed herself a small smile, the tension in her body easing slightly under his touch. The crystal's power settled within her, no longer fighting but flowing naturally. "Thanks, but we're not out of here yet." The cavern seemed to shift around them, as if responding to the crystal's departure. Kalian nodded, stepping back to give her space, though his eyes never left her face. "Right. Let's get moving before this place decides it's not done trying to kill us." His usual levity carried an undertone of urgency. As they left the cavern, Rose couldn't shake the feeling that the crystal had changed her. Not just her power, but something deeper, fundamental. The fire inside her that had always threatened to break free now felt like a part of her, controlled but undiminished. And as Kalian walked beside her, his admiration clear in every word and glance, she felt the tiniest spark of hope that she wasn't facing this transformation alone. though somewhere in the back of her mind a small voice wondered if that hope might prove dangerous. Kalian stayed close, his presence both reassuring and distracting. He hadn't stopped watching her since the cavern, his admiration as obvious as the teasing grin he usually wore. But now his gaze carried something deeper, a reverence that made Rose's chest tighten every time she caught him looking. The way he moved around her had changed, too, more protective than playful, as if he understood the magnitude of what she now carried. Each time their eyes met, she felt that dangerous spark of connection growing stronger. As dusk fell and the sky deepened into its ever-present twilight, the shadows grew restless again. Rose felt them before she saw them, the faint, prickling sensation at the back of her neck that always preceded an attack. The crystal pulsed faster against her palm, as if sensing the approaching danger. "Kalian," she said sharply, stopping in her tracks. He immediately drew his blade, his body tense and alert. Gone was the playful demeanor, replaced by lethal focus. "What is it?" Before she could answer, the ground around them erupted in a frenzy of motion. More shadow beasts poured from the fissures, their twisted forms moving with unnerving speed. But this time, they weren't alone. Among them stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its shape vaguely humanoid but radiating an aura of pure malice. The air itself seemed to recoil from its presence. "Stay close," Rose commanded, uncoiling her whip as the beasts lunged toward them. The crystal's energy surged through her arms, making the weapon glow with newfound power. The battle was fiercer than before. The beasts seemed stronger, more coordinated, as if the cloaked figure were guiding them with invisible strings. Rose's whip lashed out in blazing arcs, her flames searing through the creatures with a precision that surprised even her. Kalian moved like a shadow himself, his blade cutting down any that slipped past her defense, their movements perfectly synchronized. When the cloaked figure finally stepped forward, Rose felt its power slam into her like a tidal wave. It raised a hand, and a torrent of shadows surged toward her, threatening to engulf her in its endless void. But this time, Rose didn't falter. The crystal's power surged within her, responding to her determination. With a shout that echoed through the wasteland, she unleashed a wave of fire that collided with the shadow, consuming it in a brilliant explosion of light that turned night to day. As the shadows dissolved and the battlefield fell silent, Rose dropped to one knee, the adrenaline fading and leaving exhaustion in its wake. Kalian was at her side in an instant, his hands steadying her, warm and solid against her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. His eyes searched her face, looking for signs of injury. "I'm fine," she said, though her breathing was laboured. The crystal hummed softly in her grip, its power settling back to a gentle pulse. That was something new. Kalian nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. His thumb traced a small circle on her shoulder, perhaps unconsciously. "You were incredible, Firebrand." Again. She managed a small smile, her exhaustion tempered by his words and the warmth of his touch. "Let's find a place to camp. I don't think I can handle another fight like that tonight." The admission of vulnerability felt easier now, with him. They found a sheltered alcove not far from the battlefield, its rocky walls providing some protection from the bitter wind. Rose built the fire again, its warmth chasing away the chill that had settled into her bones. She sat close to the flames, the crystal resting on the ground beside her, its light flickering faintly in harmony with the fire. Every now and then it would pulse brighter, as if responding to her thoughts. Kalian sat opposite her, his expression unreadable as he watched her through the dancing flames. For a long while neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts and the weight of the day's events. "You've changed," Kalian said finally, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the still air. Rose glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "The crystal," he said, gesturing to it. His eyes reflected its glow, making them seem deeper, more intense. It's not just power, is it? It's something else. Something deeper. She looked down at the crystal, her fingers brushing its smooth surface. It warmed at her touch, like a living thing responding to her presence. It's hard to explain, she admitted. It's amplifying everything. My fire, my thoughts, even my emotions. It's overwhelming, but at the same time, it feels like I'm finally in control. Kalian leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. The firelight caught the angles of his face, softening them. And how does it feel? To be in control? Rose hesitated, her gaze meeting his across the flames. Terrifying, she admitted, the word carrying the weight of years of doubt, because now I know what I'm capable of, and I'm not sure I like what I see. Kalian reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the crystal. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and for a moment she couldn't look away. The crystal pulsed brighter between their joined hands. You don't have to be afraid of yourself, he said softly. Not when you've got someone who believes in you. Her chest tightened, and she looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. Why do you care so much? Kalian's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made her heart ache. Because I see you, Rose. Not the fire, not the weapon the Order wants you to be. Just you. And that's enough. The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time she let herself lean into the warmth he offered. As the fire crackled softly between them, Rose rested her head against his shoulder, the tension in her body slowly fading. The crystal's light seemed to soften, matching the gentle rhythm of their breathing. For the rest of the night, they stayed close, the silence between them no longer heavy but comforting. And though Rose couldn't name the feelings stirring within her, feelings that made the crystal pulse with a warm, steady light, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Oh, you've found your way here, have you? Curious about what's next? Pauses. Good, because there's plenty more where this came from.
If you want to stay in the know, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications, unless of course you enjoy surprises. But something tells me you don't like being left in the dark. Go on, make sure you don't miss a thing, because once you're here, Whispers, there's no turning back.